Hi folks, my name is Fiona McKenzie from Orange Compass, and this short video is an introduction to complexity, complex adaptive systems, and how to see the system and make it visible. When we think about complexity and applying a systems lens, what we're really trying to do is do three things. One is we're trying to see the system, to see some of the intangible parts, the interconnections between the parts, to really understand the whole. And then we're trying to work with the complexity that we uncover through a whole different range of methods, processes, and tools. And similarly, we're trying to engage in a practice of ongoing learning and adaptation. So today's video is really focused on what it means to think about complexity and to see the system. Firstly, let's just start with what is a system. A system is a group of diverse parts that function as a whole. So when we talk about a system, we're talking about the elements, agents, or actors. So in this image, the blue dots are essentially could be described as actors. We're also interested in the interconnections and relationships between them. So a lot of seeing the system is actually about making the connections between parts visible. And that is really, if we look here, the blue arrows, we're trying to actually understand what is the nature of those. Those arrows themselves form feedback loops. So we're trying to understand what are the different feedback loops and the connections that might cascade out across the system. Really to understand the purpose of the system. The system is often perfectly designed for the purpose it intends to deliver. And the outcomes we get are essentially the outcomes of that design, whether we like them or not. Inputs and outputs, we're trying to understand whether, particularly in open systems, what are the other influences, and also the boundary of the system. So when we're thinking about systems, the boundary is often quite subjective. What we decide is in or out says as much about our own mental models, our own worldviews, than it does about the system itself. So we often draw boundaries or negotiate boundaries collaboratively to try and actually understand a system of interest to us and what might be influencing different actions, behaviours, patterns in that system. Many systems are actually simple systems, but most human systems are complex. So complexity arises when we're actually looking at the interactions, the nature of the relationships between the parts. That's where complexity comes from, and also through the nature of the feedback loops. So open systems that are influenced by internal and external inputs and outputs, are very often difficult to define a boundary because they are open and because there are so many influences. And that's why part of it is so subjective, is we're really just trying to agree the system that is most useful for us to work with, rather than try and map a perfect system that somehow magically exists out in the wild. What I'm going to do here is essentially give you an introduction to complexity and complex adaptive systems in 8 concepts. So hopefully haven't overly summarized everything, but this is really deriving from all the different literature, recognizing that complexity and the theory comes from a whole range of disciplines, everything from cybernetics through to soft systems methodology. There's all sorts of different approaches over time. It's not new either. And to be honest, some of it is catching up with a lot of the ways in which many Indigenous and First Nations communities actually already think. It's really us trying to move out of a mechanistical and linear way of thinking and think more about interconnections and essentially holism instead of reductionism. But anyway, let's try it out. So 8 concepts for complexity to try and understand this. The first is, what is complexity? Essentially, as I said before, it's a state which can be understood through patterns rather than parts. If we just stand back and look at a tree, we don't understand the forest. So what we're really trying to do here is look at what are the interactions and feedback between the system components in order to try and see those broader patterns and processes that are happening. Openness, essentially, complex systems are affected by external environments. It's more like an ocean than a fish tank. A fish tank's very controlled, an ocean not so much. They're adaptive, which means they're capable of learning from feedback and reacting to changes in context. So this is also really important. It means systems constantly evolve towards the purpose, whatever their underlying purpose is. But it also means that every intervention that we make is likely to cause a reaction that we may not expect, but also the system will change as a result of intervention, eventually making it out of date. Systems are also self-organising, so the ability here of a system to organise itself from apparent randomness into organised patterns of behaviour without direction or seemingly without direction can appear quite challenging for some people. This idea of no single conductor or central controller In actual fact, the organisation comes through those interactions, feedback and patterns. So it doesn't need centralised control. 4 more concepts. One which is quite tricky for a lot of people is emergence. So this idea of transitioning from one pattern to another. And again, we can only see these patterns by stepping back and looking at the whole. We're not going to see them just by looking at one part. And this is really where that saying the whole is greater than the sum of the parts comes from. So if you think about a lot of patterns in nature are emergent patterns, things like how ants move, how birds fly, how fish move in a school. Like what we're really seeing there is a broader pattern without centralized control. Similarly, we can see that in a lot of our human systems, economic systems, health systems, food systems. The way that a loaf of bread gets from a field of wheat through to where it gets processed, to where it gets produced and baked into a loaf, like there is no central coordinator for bread. The system organizes itself to deliver that. When we talk about feedback loops, there's lots of different ways to frame and conceptualize feedback loops, things like reinforcing, stabilizing, positive or negative feedback loops. We won't go into that, but essentially it's to say that feedback loops can both sustain or interrupt patterns. So something like a air conditioning system has a feedback loop where it adjusts itself based on the temperature results. Similarly, in complex systems, there's all sorts of feedback loops, which are actually meaning patterns are being adjusted over time. Non-linearity, this essentially, again, is, as we talk about things coming from different areas, it's the idea from chaos theory about the butterfly effect. This is a similar concept. The idea that change in 2 or more variables doesn't equal the sum of its effects. So basically it's a fancy way of saying that we'll often get more change than we expect from small interventions, and sometimes the reverse is true as well. It means change and the results of an impact or an intervention can be counterintuitive, and they can seemingly occur or manifest a long way from where the initial cause happened. So part of our work in systems thinking is trying to understand root cause. Are we just seeing a symptom, or are we actually seeing a cause? And do we really understand what's going on underneath the surface? And finally, I mentioned before purpose. So systems can have varying different purposes, some more formal than others. They can also develop other purposes over time, and part of our role is to really try and understand what is the system replicating, what is it seeking, what is it delivering, and why. Because if we don't understand and respond to that purpose, then we're really looking at sometimes superficial points of intervention. So a purpose is really a powerful leverage point in system design. Now, I will say not everything is complex, and we can also think about our challenges in a similar way. So in a complex context, or particularly with a complex challenge, the way we would respond or work in that context might be different than if it was simple. In a simple situation, we might just need best practice skilled workers and coordination, which might mean we want to make a cake, we need the best recipe and a good chef. In a complicated context, we have a pretty good idea of how we want to respond, but we need experts, knowledge, cooperation to make it happen. In a complex context, we are not going to know how to respond until we've actually worked in the system, disrupted the system, intervened in the system, and seen how it itself responds. So this can also sound quite tricky, and it sounds counterintuitive, but what it's saying is that we actually have to be constantly probing the system. It's that emergent practice, willing to take what feels like risks, and also collaborating in order to understand and sense what is happening in the system. This is actually not foreign to us. We do this all the time, often in our personal lives. Even think about in the garden, when you're gardening, or if you're working in nature, when you're driving a car, all these different things, we're constantly probe, sense, respond. We're not just sitting back, creating an elaborate plan and then expecting it all to work out. And so it's important to understand and think about these different contexts and what sort of context are we working in. So how would you know if you're dealing with a complex context? Often the problem is difficult to frame. It'll keep evolving over time. Cause and effect relationships are actually pretty murky. It's hard to make them visible or even understand what's a cause, what's an effect. You know, does that matter? And what are the symptoms? There's probably a lot of different stakeholders involved and who all have equally unique but valid and different views. There's also no obvious right or wrong set of solutions. There might be a whole set of values, judgments, arguments happening, but it's not something that can just be factually established. And there's often no objective measure of success. We can't just have a quantifiable measure to say this was done. in the right way. So even the way we evaluate our work can be quite challenging. What this means for us, which is really important, is that the way we work has to change as well. If things are unpredictable, then we actually need to be ready to respond to that over time, and to the fact that the effects we have from the things that we did may not be the ones we anticipated. So we're going to be willing to adapt. Unknowable in the sense that no single person can know the whole system, and so we've actually got to draw on collective wisdom. And unsolvable in the sense that adaptive systems, given that they're resilient and they learn, any attempt at change can be quickly swallowed back up into the system, either into status quo or into a new state. So it's not like we can just put out a solution and walk away. It's a bit like you can't just get in a car and stop steering. You've actually got to keep adapting over time. So the health system is a classic example of a highly complex system, which has overlaps with a whole other set of systems as well. But for everything from the treatment and care of health symptoms or issues through to broader issues of things like public safety in a pandemic, the governance and policy frameworks, the ways things get distributed, the accessibility and affordability of care, the economics, the pricing of health, the way social norms might play into it, the way stigma might play out, vulnerable populations might be affected, the use or disuse or the contestability of evidence and what counts as evidence for whether it's for vaccinations or anything else, and the whole space of prevention, which links back into behaviour and social norms and all sorts of other things around not just treatment and care, but preventing the need for treatment, for example. It's a massively complex space, which also interfaces with a whole other set of cultural, social, economic, and environmental factors. So it's just an example to show that many of the human systems we've created are quite complex and adaptive. When we talk about systems thinking or complexity thinking, what we're really trying to do here is provide ways to understand complex systems or complex environments and to make those underlying relationships and interdependencies visible. So we're really trying to help see the patterns that are occurring. This can help us understand vulnerabilities and opportunities for intervention, and also, as I said, the patterns and behaviours. But this is not about trying to predict, control, or create certainty in systems. That doesn't matter how well we map a system and its complexity, it will not reduce that complexity for us. It will not make that system predictable. But what we can do is we can reframe our understanding of the challenge that we're facing. We can think better more broadly about what the solution space might be. We might have hindered our own thinking into thinking about a sector or a silo, or not even understanding all the other interconnections that we could have been considering and coming up with ideas about possible solutions or interventions. We can start to surface some of those hidden relationships we might otherwise drive onto unanticipated consequences, but we can also be aware that unanticipated consequences are highly likely and we're going to need to respond. And similarly, it can be about surfacing inherent assumptions for testing. So this whole process of working with complexity, learning and adapting means we've actually got to move into a mindset where we're constantly testing and learning, and we're surfacing deeply held assumptions, and which could sit within our own worldviews, our paradigms, ways of working, the way power is navigated. All these things can influence how we work in a system, and we're trying to unpack those things. So as I said before, a big part of systems thinking is about making the invisible visible. And I talked about the blue arrows. What do I mean by those blue arrows? Essentially what we're saying is it's not enough just to focus on actors, institutions in the system. That's a tendency for us to do that because they're visible. What we're saying is there are a lot of things that govern interactions between parts in the system that set up all sorts of patterns that we also have to have an eye on. So a simple way to think about this is in 5 elements. So firstly, relationships, things like networks, values, engagement, trust, power, how they all impact and influence interaction. Structures, so they could be laws and institutional rules, so visible structures. They can also be social norms. If I started singing on this Zoom video or doing weird things, there's probably a whole set of social norms that would come into play where they would be enforcing the way I would respond to this in different contexts. Similarly, there'll be processes, so agenda setting, decision making, the way policy actually gets implemented, not how it's written in the textbooks. That all comes into play, as does resources. Resources are not just about money. It's also about things like who has access to data, who interprets data, who's counted as having knowledge or knowledgeable, who has the time to actually do the work or be involved, or how is time used to limit the work. And similarly, mental models, those mindsets, paradigms, and hidden assumptions that sit underneath all the things that we're doing. So as I said before, we're really just trying to make visible and understand all these different interactions and to really start thinking about patterns, not just parts. It's also about looking beneath. So when we talk about seeing below the surface, what we're trying to say is that there's also hidden patterns. So the most obvious ones to us might be events and symptoms, things that are happening in the world right now. For example, we're seeing a pandemic, for example, rolling out at the moment. But underneath that, you've got patterns of behaviour, how we're responding to that over time, what's repetitive and familiar, what's unusual, what's happening in that space, the structures that sit underneath that and actually create the patterns and help define the system. Things like all those things I talk about, relationships, structures, processes, resources that are really what we might call structural elements, but also mental models, how we think about the world, including all those biases and blind spots. So really this idea of seeing below the surface, sometimes the iceberg model is useful to think about that, or we can take it even further with causal layered analysis, which talks about even the myths and metaphors and the deep narratives and stories that we tell ourselves that allow a certain system or reality to persist. So all these things we're trying to understand and make visible and see how they show up in our work and in the world around us. When it comes to applying a complexity lens, this is why we pay so much attention to different dimensions that otherwise might sound a bit fluffy or intangible, but in actual fact, they're really important. So the quality and nature of relationships and interconnections, the interventions that influence these relationships, the changes required of all system actors. So particularly when we're talking about systems change, it can't just be someone else over there has to do something different, but not me. We're actually saying because the system is connected, it actually means we have to think deeply about what is all our role in replicating current reality, in actually enacting the system every day in the ways we work and behave. The impact of deep system structures and patterns, often we can get puzzled while change isn't happening, but when it turns out we've just been playing with symptoms, not looking at deep cause and effect or deeper patterns. The distribution of power, decision making, control, and resources is really important because these all have deep impacts on not just the way in which the system works, but the way in which we might seek to create systems change. The different ways of knowing and being, we're ensuring they're incorporated because we're recognizing that knowledge is not just book-based, it's not formal. There's all sorts of ways of knowing, of lived experience, of communicating, capturing insight that are just as valid as anything that might be written or appear in a journal paper. And similarly, those processes of agenda setting, including values, vision, and purpose, they are really important because they actually affect how we see the system. Who we've included or excluded will affect where we draw the boundary on the system. Who we've included and excluded will affect what patterns we detect or even what dimensions we notice. So even the way our values come into play in this work actually matters because it influences the work. And finally, just to finish, to say this is why when we talk about systemic practice, what we're really talking about is how we navigate and work with complexity through things like constantly questioning our assumptions, trying to work at different levels concurrently, trying to see the system and the organisation or the micro, meso, macro levels. We're trying to really work at those different levels because we see the system unfold in all these different ways. At the organisational level, at a broader systems level, wherever we draw that boundary, it's not necessarily at a policy or a state level, and similarly at an individual level. We're also looking at how different perspectives work, how power and agency and responsibility come into play, and things like activating and resisting forces. What we're really doing there is we're starting to understand different types of feedback loops. All of this is part of us trying to understand and work out what is the water we are swimming in. If we're like fish in the ocean, and this ocean is this big system, can we actually see that water? Can we actually work with it and understand what's going on? So the final thing to reflect on here is in your own system of interest, whatever that is, have a think about what are some of the dominant patterns of behaviour in your system, in the system you're working. Where's it frozen? Where is it stuck? Or maybe where is it unchanging over a long period of time versus where is it dynamic and changing and maybe you're seeing a whole set of short-term trends evolve? Who influences what or who? So what factors reinforce or block each other? So even in this question, you might ask yourself, what feedback loops am I actually embedded in? What critical assumptions are we making and how many of those are implicit or hidden from others? Have we articulated our assumptions to others? Have we collectively generated and tested a set of assumptions? And can we take them out and test them even further with others, people that we may not even have thought about involving? So that's probably enough here to say that the system is uh, complex in many contexts. It's not always, but in human systems, it's often complex. But what we're talking about here is it's a different way of seeing the world. It doesn't mean all the other ways and approaches of seeing the world aren't valid. They are. What we're saying is here's another lens to see the world. And what we're asking is for people to step back and really try and look at longer term, deep behaviour and structure, those interconnections and feedback loops. And to quote Danella Meadows here, you cannot navigate well in an interconnected, feedback dominated world unless you take your eyes off the short term events and look for long-term behaviour and structure, and unless you're aware of false boundaries and bounded rationality. So with that, I might close there, and hopefully that's been a useful summary or introduction, very brief introduction to complexity and systems thinking.